Hello, and welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Kathleen Daggett with the Friends of History. These monthly lectures are provided free of charge by the Friends of History of the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. Your contributions directly support programs and exhibits at the History Museum. Should you wish to give a gift, please go to our website and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Our speakers today are Bridget Harrington and Michael Moore, historic photojournalists. Bridget and Michael's topic today is titled Silent Witnesses, Exploring the Hidden Histories of Abandoned Locations in New Mexico, and is based upon their extensive explorations and research into little-known towns in our state. What started as a personal project to explore New Mexico has grown into a quest to create compelling images of little-known places in the state and share the stories behind them. After starting with an old school roadmap, Michael Moore has now spent almost 3,000 hours researching and creating a Google Earth map that they now use for navigation. Bridget Harrington uses out-of-print books and maps, cemetery records, and newspapers to create narratives that make these places real and relatable. Most of the sites Michael and Bridget document are long abandoned. They uncover little-known locations, then dig through many sources to find information and personal stories about these communities and their former inhabitants. Once they locate and research ruins, Michael and Bridget visit and photograph the sites. Bridget Harrington and Michael Moore are photographers and history enthusiasts who are passionate about the hidden history of the great state of New Mexico. Both are lifelong photojournalists who don't make their primary living from photography. Bridget is a marketing, communications, and visual arts professional, and Michael is an industrial sales engineer and small engine pilot. For the past 8 years, they have roamed across New Mexico and documented their photography expeditions on Facebook and Instagram. And now, let's welcome Bridget Harrington and Michael Moore.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to the Friends of History for their invitation. We'll get into our presentation. We'll start out by saying that we aren't the only photographers in the state who document ghost towns, but we do it very differently than everyone else. We uncover locations that you aren't going to see on the roadside or in a tourism book, and we dig to find the information and the personal stories that aren't easily available. Before we get into the story portion, though, we'll briefly explain how we ended up here. We started this project as a way to see the state, to get to know each other, and to hone our technical skills. And in the beginning, we started with an old school roadmap. Paper is pretty critical when you go to places where GPS is often faulty, and we covered every mapped road across 3 paper maps. And then we started to get curious about what else was beyond the freeways and the county roads along the way. And we started collecting vintage maps, railroad maps, out-of-print books, and other resources. Much of what we document is long abandoned, as in 100 years abandoned. And in many cases, no one is left to tell us what we are seeing. And that brings us to Google Earth and how we use it.
As Kathleen said, I spent about 3,000 hours researching Google Earth and finding the locations, painstakingly mapping and naming what is left of the early settlements in our state. Spanish settlements along the Colinas, for example, or the Midwestern settler communities of eastern New Mexico. We also have layers of mapping for old mines and old native settlements. Once we locate ruins and cross-reference them to what they once were, we visit, photograph, and share the information on our Facebook and Instagram pages. In some cases, we have to work to get landowner permission, since many of them are on private, gated land. But Facebook being public, we sometimes get contacted by the families themselves who extend invitations to us. As we talk about these towns, we will not share their names out of respect for their privacy. In this presentation, we will discuss 6 settlements. A few you may have heard of, but we were able to get access to them that most cannot. We'll show you how they look on Google Earth and then dive into the history and the stories we've uncovered about them, along with the photographs. The first settlement we will profile is Atencio.
Atencio is 7 miles from the Oklahoma line and 24 miles north of Clayton in Union County. It is within the borders of the Miller Ranch, but the buildings in the cemetery are off of one of the ranch roads. Often the clues to what ruins were lie in street markers, the ranch road being Atencio Road. We use the term road very loosely as the pathway to the town site is not paved and is very eroded in a 45-degree incline. There are several ruins within an open area, with more clustered in the hills and behind fences nearby. It's very obvious that nobody has been here in some time. And then you see a few decades-old cars that are a sharp contrast to the carefully constructed stone buildings. We learned from place names in New Mexico, which is a useful and frequently updated reference that tells us that Atencio was named for a Spanish family, the earliest of whom, José de Atencia de Alcala y Escobar, arrived in New Mexico in 1693. Atencio had a post office for a short time from 1910 to 1914. At the time of the permit being granted, it was estimated that the post office would serve up to 250 people. The nearest mail route that served the area was out of Wheelus, Oklahoma. Now, if you're a military history buff, Wheelus might sound familiar to you as it's where Kit Carson built Camp Nichols. Camp Nichols was midway between Fort Union and Fort Dodge and offered protection to travelers on the Cimarron route of the Santa Fe Trail. From everything we could find, however, there isn't any evidence that Atencio ever grew larger than 100 people. In the January 2nd, 1915 issue of the Clayton News, we learn of elections being held for Justice of the Peace and Constable in each of the precincts. Atencio was Union County Precinct 16, and voting was done at E. Gallego's house, with the judges being Jesus Trujillo, J. E. Skelton, and R. Stubblefield. This gives us a sense of how isolated some of these towns were. Elections were held at a citizen's home. There is very little mentioned in the papers at the time about Atencio. There were 2 homestead abandonments that were published in 1915. One citizen, Jacobo Pacheco, was mentioned many times as traveling throughout the county on business. By 1917, he was elected as county commissioner, but we don't know what became of him after that time. The town itself was largely abandoned by 1930. Cemeteries can also give clues of the character of a community, as well as being of value to genealogists, and it's for those reasons that we photographed these as well. The Atencio Cemetery is located halfway between the ruins and the entry path. It's easy to miss as it is not marked and very overgrown. We found it scanning Google Earth for a telltale square or rectangular area. There's a gate that is unlocked, although the clasp had rusted shut and it was difficult to open. The skies that afternoon were very dark. The radio would broadcast tornado and hail warnings for Union County. So our time was of the essence here. Many of the monuments were handmade and are not in good condition due to erosion and the elements. Now, our dog Whiskey was particularly interested in one pile of tumbleweed and dead brush in the middle of the cemetery, and he kept circling the area. We called for him to move away from it several times and he refused, instead nosing under the pile. Now, the last thing we needed was for him to be sprayed or bitten by something when we were 4 hours from home. We pulled apart the pile and saw a pair of eyes, and soon we were face to face with a portrait on one of the stones. Maria Martinez Villapando was a wife and the mother of a toddler when she passed away at age 20. After her death, her husband moved to Colorado where he had family. Her stone's portrait is from her wedding and is of exceptional quality for the time. You could see the lace on her veil, she had a dimple in her right cheek, and that she had curly hair. We were told by a Facebook follower that her son made regular visits to the cemetery as an adult, but he passed away in 2014. So we were honored to be the first non-family members to see her face in nearly 100 years. Finally, Atencio is one of the family names that is cited as crypto-Jewish, that is, people of Sephardic or Ashkenazi ancestry who adopted Spanish names during the Inquisition, hiding their Jewish identity over generations. Many, known as conversos, outwardly practice Catholicism or Protestantism while retaining many facets of Judaic faith in their daily lives. Things such as not eating pork, checking eggs for blood spots, covering the head during prayer or for church, or sweeping rooms toward the doorway. New Mexico has large pockets of Jewish heritage communities, and we see signs in many cemeteries of our travels. There is a growing interest in many New Mexicans to explore their heritage, and if this describes your family, we can direct you to these two excellent books, To the End of the Earth, A History of the Crypto-Jews in New Mexico by our former state historian Stanley Hordes, and Remnants of Crypto-Jews Among Hispanic Americans by Gloria Golden. Occasionally, early towns were more wishful thinking than reality, and Obar is a town that illustrates that.
The long stretch of freeway that is now New Mexico 54 in Union County is mostly traveled by truck drivers going between New Mexico and Texas. Train tracks run parallel to the freeway and are still used by freight traffic today. Very little remains on this long stretch of land, but once there was a settlement here. Obar, originally called Perry for an early landowner, was on New Mexico 54 between Logan and Naravisa. The only prominent sign that anything was ever there, and what caught our attention to want to look further, is a historic monument along the roadside, which was erected by former resident Frank Berlin. Frank's father was the proprietor of the general store, the postmaster for a time, a railroad agent, and the latter publisher of the newspaper. The monument lists the names of the first settlers to the area. Perry was originally a railroad switch and later a station on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. The settlement started in 1906 on ranch land owned by the Howry family and had a post office, a newspaper called the Perry Progress, later which became the Obar Progress, published by Levi Kleinfelter, a school built by Lido Writings, and several businesses. The post office operated under the name of Perry from 1907 to 1908. In 1910, the settlement was moved to the south side of the tracks by the New Mexico Land and Immigration Company and renamed Obar, a name which came from the Circle Bar brand owned by Coots, a family in the area. A few buildings were stuck on the tracks for the better part of a day, an inconvenience and somewhat embarrassing event that was reported in newspapers around the state and as far away as Kansas. In New Mexico papers, however, the event was downplayed and denied as having been that bad. The company map plotted and laid out a city of nearly 3,000 lots, and the town was heavily advertised in slick brochures such as this one as a promised land in the Midwest. And that advertising brought in people by the hundreds. In July of 1909, the Tucumcari News and Tucumcari Times stated, Obar spends $1,000 for advertising. New Mexico Land and Immigration Company has 50 men on the road selling town lots. Obar is said to have $20,000 hotel, a town well, and the town is donating concrete blocks for the railroad depot. On March 6, 1909, the paper stated Obar's largest industry, the gravel pit, was employing 75 to 100 men. Potential being advertised was more wishful thinking than fact, as rainfall was sparse and the quality of the soil was not the best. It seemed plausible, though, because people visiting the area to see what the advertising talked about did so in a very rare rainy season that the area had and saw green grasses and other signs of growth, as well as early settlers seeming to do well. We learned tidbits about the going-ons in Obar from Mary Lynn Monco's book, Wake County, New Mexico, 1903 to 2003, A Pictorial History, as well as newspaper reports of the times and articles by Don McEvely and Curry County's historian. As we talk about those, we'll show you some of what remains of Obar. Miss Wiley and her family opened the Wiley Hotel, and W.C. Old Buckhard had a blacksmith shop. Other businesses included Foxworth and Galbraith Lumber Company, Schneider Bank, Pearl Billards Hall, Reeser Meats, H.P. White Nickel Store, Jones and Cheever Grain and Seed, Perry Investments Company, Snyder Real Estate, and Perry and Robinson Real Estate. 15 or 20 blocks of sidewalk were laid, and it's not uncommon to see 200 or 300 people in Obar on a Saturday afternoon. The Methodist minister from Naravisa held church every 2 weeks with O.S. Greaser as the Sunday school superintendent. Recreation in Obar consisted of a baseball team and horse racing. At some point, a two-story school building, the remains of which are shown here, was constructed by D.W. Rowe. There were 2 rooms on each floor and as many as 4 teachers. The last classes were held in 1941. Obar had a social club, the Show Me Literally Club, that put on dances, plays, and other social events. Show Me events were considered a step above your standard community performance and were reported on as far away as Santa Fe and El Paso. A well was run for irrigation and many crops, as well as an orchard, were planted. The concrete sidewalks mentioned by Moncus were being constructed in 1910. There was also a puzzling breeding well being reported. The town site was abandoned by 1954 because farming proved to be very difficult and unprofitable. The promise of the area being a large railroad hub never materialized either. The hub was eventually built in Tucumcari. Spanish sheepherders and settlers moving from Mexico comprise many of the settlements, and they are concentrated along rivers such as the Conchas, the Galenas, and others, and in or near valleys. The next 4 settlements we will discuss: San Ignacio, Sombrio, Variadero, and Trementina, fit this description.
San Ignacio, also known as La Placita de San Ignacio, is in Guadalupe County at the edge of the Pintada Arroyo and Canyon and is 18 miles west of Santa Rosa. An earlier site for the village was just a short distance east of the current one across the arroyo. San Ignacio was once the cultural hub and social gathering place for the families in the area. The town was named in honor of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Spaniard and founder of the Jesuits. The remains of the town lie behind the gates of a ranch owned by one of the grandchildren of Severo and Genova Chavez, the original homesteaders. Here we see a portrait of Severo and Genova Chavez. The May 16th, 1911 edition of the Fort Sumner Review published population counts of San Ignacio and surrounding Guadalupe County areas from the results of the 1910 census. Almost 400 people lived here at one time. The Fort Sumner Review frequently published news stories in Spanish and English, being aware that the readership was comprised of people that spoke one or the other, but rarely both. San Ignacio had a post office from 1886 into the 1940s. Each time the post office was moved, a new application was required, hence multiple ones. Severo Chavez was one of the applicants, and his daughter and her husband, Max and Piedad Sanchez, ran the business of the post office. Post offices in our early days functioned like banks. In addition to handling mail and packages, they also held money, and some also sold tickets for the nearby passenger trains. The nearest passenger train to San Ignacio was in Pintada. The tracks are still there, but now they only carry freight. In addition to the post office, San Ignacio also had a school, which was built in the 1930s and used into the 1940s, as well as a church. We mentioned the town site as being located across the arroyo. The present church dates from the 1930s. All that is left at the old site, which is across the arroyo, are the ruins of the original church, known as La Iglesia de Cañon, and its attached cemetery. On this trip, we were unable to see it as our vehicle wouldn't make it across the arroyo. The current church is still used and is maintained by the descendants of the original settlers. And there are statues said to have been from Spain that are also kept and brought out for masses and celebrations. There's a yearly celebration for families that is held in the last week of July. Next, we'll visit another town that is near San Ignacio named Sombrio. The people here certainly would have known each other, as the towns were both active during the same time period.
Sombrio is a collection of brick ruins and a cemetery about 5 miles west of San Ignacio, in the Pintada Arroyo at the bottom of Milagro Canyon. Here we show the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Sombrio from Google Earth, which is how we located Sombrio, as well as what is left today. It was completed in 1909, and the cemetery developed around the same time. The last graves here date from the 1940s. Many of the stones are crumbling and illegible. The stones in the cemetery, deducing by both the names and the symbolism on the stones, 6-pointed stars and candles, point to Sombrio possibly being a crypto-Jewish community, just like Atencia. Some names known to be adopted by conversos include Espinosa, Perez, and Enriquez. There is very little documented information on Sombrio. An application for the post office was filed by Miss Dalmatilia Garcia on April 9th, 1935, and was granted in January of 1936. The post office operated for nearly a year. We found it exactly where Miss Garcia indicated that it would be on her form. One room we photographed had a very heavy rusted safe in the middle. We initially thought this room was a bank. However, post offices on or near rail lines in those days served many of the same functions that banks did. While parts of the Pecos Valley had migrants that moved from place to place to work the farms, the careful construction of the buildings here suggests a more permanent intended community. So why did people settle here? In the years after the Civil War, New Mexico Territory was undergoing rapid growth and expansion. Various railroads competed with each other to entice people from the East Coast and southern states to work and settle here. The Rock Island Rail Line pamphlet called New Mexico the land of sunshine, extolled the landscape, favorable conditions for ranching, and long growing seasons. It even mentioned liberal homesteading practices and advertised that very low home seekers excursions are run by Rock Island Frisco lines each first and third Tuesday of each month. The tickets are round trip. The first class with generous return limit and liberal stopover privileges are granted. These low rates of fares are made to enable you to see the country for yourself and decide by actual inspection whether the country is all that it is claimed and meets your ideals of a home. People responded in transplanting, and little towns sprung up all along the rail lines. The 1905 governor's report to the federal government president said of Guadalupe County, the county is rapidly developing. A few years ago, it did not contain a single mile of railroad, telegraph, or even telephone line. It was practically isolated from the world and even from its neighboring counties. With the railroads have come the telegraph, new towns and new settlers and new life. Many of these settlers came here intending to farm and ranch. One of the Texas cattle companies conveniently had operations in Pastura, which were close by, and the country was known as an important shipping area for sheep and cattle. With paradise-like promises, why did Superior and towns like it die? Two things that New Mexicans are very familiar with are flash floods and dry climate the rest of the time. One of the known tributaries of the Pecos rivers is the Pintana Arroyo, and even today, erosion can be seen along the edges of the canyon. The Pecos has three sources of water. First is the snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The second is storm flow due to the floods, and the third is groundwater inflow from the springs in Santa Rosa. There were a series of floods that plagued this area in the late 1800s, each one worse than the next. People moved further and further away from the water path before leaving the area altogether. Sombrio likely tried to become a larger town with a church that was completed in 1909, the installation of the post office and telegraph lines paralleling the train route. Unfortunately, the Dust Bowl in the mid to late 1930s, followed by the economic situation brought on by World War II, most likely drove out the few people that remained. Clovis, Portales, and other areas had more opportunity, were far less isolated, and had fewer natural disasters to contend with. The town was completely abandoned by the late 1940s, as evidenced by the newest burials in the cemetery. The next town we will profile is Variadero.
Variadero, also known as Garita or La Garita, is located in San Miguel County on New Mexico State Road 104, where it crosses the Conchas River. It was founded in 1872 by Jesus Angel, a settler from Bernal, and has a present population of 31 per the 2020 census. One of our Byways followers wrote to tell us that his parents, now in their 70s, own and work a large portion of the land, and they generously showed us around. The photos that you'll see are from 2 weeks' worth of visits. The community's two names both come from Spanish terms. Variadero derives from variar, meaning to change, due to the changes in the river's course, while Garita means lookout or government building. Variadero was originally called Estrada after the first settler, Jose Lareno Estrada, who made a permanent home along the Conchas Arroyo around the time of the Civil War. Jose Lareno is across from the church on private property. His wife, Filomena Estrada de Madrid, is buried at his side. The grave marker is still visible for both of them, and it reads, Jose Lareno Estrada, 1835 to 1898, the first settler of Variadero. Garita, however, was the name given to the huge square blocks of sandstone about 8 miles southeast of Variadero along New Mexico 104, which reminded early settlers of a garita, which is a sentry post in Spanish. A small arroyo about a quarter mile northwest of the garita was named the Garita Creek. Later, settlers made homes to the west along the Garita Creek, and a small community in that area was known as Garita. Variadero had a post office from 1907 to 1923. Garita's post office started in 1918 and still operates today. When postal services were combined after the Variadero post office closed, the area developed the dual names of Garita and Variadero. Our guide grew up in the area, and he and his wife presently live in the stone house that his grandparents built 100 or so years ago, its walls 2 feet thick facing the bridge. On the day that we visited, he drove us through the hills and the arroyos on unpaved pathways, a challenging drive even for his truck. To show us the stone house is about 5 miles from the bridge, way in the hills. Some of the structures were inhabited when he was a boy. He pointed one out as being an outdoor building for cooking in warm weather, and another as possibly a chicken or a goat pen, and he mentioned that he remembered another when it had a roof. All that's left of that house are walls and some broken vigas lying about, and the framing of a window standing upright in the grass. Next, we traveled along the river and past the old dwellings that were part of the original Variadero settlement and through the wild brush and tall grass. There are petroglyphs back here, we were told. On one side of the steep rock, which had fossils embedded in its flat top, facing the river and hidden behind the brush, were a series of engravings, animals, human figures, and hands. Over them were inscriptions made by settlers with names and dates. Further back into the brush, there were other native petroglyphs inscribed on the hard granite-like rock. Animals and stylized water drawings seemed to hint that this area was a good one for hunting and that animals could be found near the river. It's humbling to consider that these inscriptions were made by people who lived and died thousands of years before we were born. We were looking upon remnants of a people that walked the land at around the same time as when Chaco Canyon was inhabited. And the most interesting surprise, a stone cross embedded in the rock at the top of one of the hills. We were told that one of the Spanish settlers put it there, but no one remembers specifically who it was. A quick browse through old newspapers gives some insight into what inspired people to settle in this beautiful but unforgiving landscape, the Homestead Act. The La Voz del Pueblo, Voice of the People, and El Independiente, the Independent, published at least 10 homestead applications per daily issue between the 1890s and into the 19-teens, claiming land entitled the small cost of a filing fee and a day of travel to Las Vegas to file the paperwork. After 5 years on the land, the original filer was entitled to the property free and clear. The title could also be acquired after only a 6-month residency and trivial improvements, provided the claimant paid the government $1.25 per acre. That was an incredible deal for those who were willing to put in the work. Here are a few of those applications. The 1912 Optic paints a picture of the ruggedness of the land at the time in its report of Variadero resident Juan Quintana appearing at the courthouse to collect bounty for coyotes and a wild cat, both of whom were considered threats to livestock and people. We learned two interesting things about life and ingenuity in Variadero looking at the homes there. Both had newspapers and magazine pages stuck to the adobe and the wood walls. We've seen this in other places and assumed that it was for decoration or makeshift wallpaper. We were told that the paper was mainly there to keep draft and wind out, a similar idea to paper and animal hair that we've seen in the walls and ruins elsewhere, but that specific paper was chosen for interest. Two of the larger houses also had what looked like a fireplace in a roofless shed next to it. The structure was a house for a water tank, and underneath was a place where a fire could be built to heat the tank of water. That may have been an alternative to having an electric water heater or having to boil pot after pot on a stove, and it was large enough for more than one home to use it. One building we learned was once a store and also a post office. Our guide remembered when it was both and also said that a family lived in the opposite side. Dual buildings where a business and living quarters for the shopkeeper and their family would be both under the same roof are pretty common even today. This building, like many others in town, was constructed in stages. The living space would be the priority as personal shelter was needed. As time and resources and need dictated, more rooms or sections would be added. This building has an adobe core with wood and plaster walls encasing them. While most of the structure is standing, there is a room where the roof fell in. As far as Variadero is concerned, no concrete postal information on anything prior to 1907 survives. Variadero's first postmaster was Sixto Martinez, followed by Kenny Potter, Sarah Potter, Andrew Brewer, Walter Hall, and Jack Nichols. You can see Sixto Martinez's beautiful handwriting on his postal application. Sixto may also have been one of the store proprietors at the time. Mention is made in the papers of the time of a man by the same name going to and from Las Vegas on business. With some imagination, you can imagine the bright room, lemon yellow walls with bright white trim, while shelving and a red door as a store. The store had a counter in front. You could still see the outline of where it was on the floor, and the post office boxes were on the right-hand wall near the window. The living area was similarly brightly decorated with red ceiling molding, a blue cabinet, and floral linoleum. There is more history as you leave Variadero, a pony truss bridge that spans the Conchas River parallel to New Mexico 104 that is no longer used. It was built in 1915 by George Morrison and the Missouri Valley Bridge and Iron Company, and was posted to the National Register of Historic Places on July 22, 1997. The last settlement we will profile is Trementina, which is up the road from Variadero on New Mexico 104.
The original settlement of Trementina is approximately at the junction of New Mexico 104 and New Mexico 419. In territorial Spanish, Trementina means pine trees. The word later was used to refer to pine sap from which turpentine was made. If you drive past Las Vegas on New Mexico 104, you will see a sign for the post office and an old gas pump. This is not Old Trementina, as some guidebooks erroneously report. The runs of the original Trementina are in the middle of three ranches that share fence lines, and we learned that all three of the owners know each other. It took some research to locate who owned what, and also to be able to negotiate access to what we will show you here. Trementina was originally a Hispanic village founded by sheep herders who grazed their sheep in the area between Canon Largo to the north, now part of the Sabacino Wilderness area, and the Variadero Mesa to the south. The Canadian River, which empties into the Trementina River to the east and the Conchas River to the west. The early pioneers migrated from Los Valles de San Agustin, Los Fuentes, Chaparrito, and La Aguila, as the rancher had indicated to us from up north, at around 1870. One rancher's land houses some older ruins, some of the present-day Trementina, and also the original Presbyterian cemetery. He told us that his and many other families came from up north and decided to stay here to farm or herd sheep or beef. He explained that the abandoned homes were built on the property for family generations ago. A relative who is also the postmaster lives in the pink house at the end of the drive. The post office was opened in a spare room at the back of the house. As he said, it didn't need much space because how much business was it going to do among a few ranches? One room was enough to meet the need, and it still operates there today. This is a map from 1942. The description, New Trementina, inexplicably started showing up on maps in around the 1970s. Nothing was actually new. The town was composed of those who stayed behind when the original settlement was vacated, because that was where they had homesteaded for generations. They just spread out further, added a few modern conveniences, and continued using the town name. Some locals, especially those whose families had been there for generations, used the distinction of old and new, or informally, so it's interesting to see it on maps. We were told that the often photographed building with the gas pump in the front was the home of the town bus driver. He bused kids from neighboring ranches to the newer school in town until he lost his leg to diabetes. The gas pump, by the way, is no longer there. There were two cemeteries in Trementina. One is the Presbyterian Cemetery and is the older of the two. It sits on the banks of the Trementina River or the Trementina Creek. You'll notice that the stones are written in Spanish because prior to 1880, nearly everyone in this area only spoke Spanish. Catholics were buried in nearby San Rafael Cemetery, and once the Trementina town site was established in the Trementina Cemetery itself. Taking these photos was somewhat of a treacherous exercise. Not only is the cemetery literally on the edge of the riverbed, which is severely eroded beyond the wall, but on the day that these were taken, the area was forecasted to receive some heavy rain with damaging winds. It was already muddy, windy, and cold. We went back to Trementina the following weekend because, as we had mentioned earlier, the original settlement is locked behind locked gates. At one point, this was a public area that offered tours. However, the rancher that owns the land it is on decided to limit access, both for liability reasons and to protect the site from vandalism and theft. For a time, reunions of previous residents were held here in the summer, and families still visit and use the cemetery. After we contacted him and explained what we do, document history, stories, and images from disappearing places, he allowed us in, provided he personally accompanied us while we were in there. Santiago Blue and Juana Madrid Blue, along with their 14 children, are credited with founding the community. Land ownership during those days was very loosely defined. The early Spanish who settled in this area defined land ownership by points of reference. When the area was surveyed by the U.S. Geological Survey in 1880, however, many people lost their land because they did not understand the new laws and did not file for homesteads. Other U.S. citizens from the East took advantage of the new laws and homesteaded tracts of lands. The Spanish lived peacefully with the homesteaders and intermarried, raising their children and families together. The 1980 census has listed Trementina as a hamlet, and in 1901, the post office was established with Martin Gourlay as the first postmaster. Alice Blake, a Presbyterian medical missionary, is recognized as the organizer behind the town. In its early days, Trementina was hit by diphtheria, typhoid, and malaria, and she assisted in each of those outbreaks by providing medical care and educating about prevention. Miss Blake was also the town school teacher. The Presbyterian creed values knowledge and education, and it was important to her to pass on those ideals to the children in the town. The schoolhouse, which was also the town church, was built by Reverend Jose Amurito Cruz for $300. By March 1902, 40 children had enrolled in school, learning English, in addition to keeping their native Spanish. 1916, the church/schoolhouse burned down, but because it was built from flagstone, large portions were reused. The second reconstruction was dedicated to Santiago and Juana Blue, who were the original owners of the land. That became the town site. Around 1919, a larger school was built about 4 miles from town. The school children would graduate 8th grade from here and then move on to high school in Albuquerque or Santa Fe. After we photographed the town, the rancher drove us up to the cemetery. This was the town's Catholic cemetery and is still used by those in the area. It is up a steep, rocky, unpaved incline about a mile from the old town center, and getting there by car would be impossible. Many generations of his and the early settlers' family are interred there. Out of respect for living family, we are only showing the older stones here. The new school in Trementina is located on Route 419, just northeast of the road's intersection with Route 104. It was constructed as a WPA project. The building, which we were told has grand vigas and a large auditorium inside. It is privately owned and occasionally used for community gatherings. For a time, this was a bustling small town. In addition to the church and school, the town had a laundry, a mission house, a community house with a small library for town gatherings, and about a dozen private homes in a central area. Other homes on surrounding ranches were considered a part of the town on the outskirts. The original Trementina has been a ghost town since the 1950s. The Depression and droughts that hit the area hard, and after World War II, several families moved to Las Vegas or Albuquerque to make a living. The ranchers and farmers that stayed behind left descendants, families of which about 150 people still own and work the land.
We thank you for taking the time to tune into our presentation today. You can find us on Facebook under NM Byways, on Instagram at Enchanted Byways Photo, and we can also be reached by email for any questions or comments at enchantedbyways.photo@gmail.com.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. I love all the photos of the sites, and I kept wondering if you took like passengers on the adventures ever, but it seemed great spots to go visit. What has been your favorite place to find and to describe? I don't know if it was one of these 6 or someplace else that you weren't able to share.
There are so many places in this state that I could say are my favorite. I mean, I am absolutely in love with an old church in Holman that is in dire need of somebody to come in and restore it. If I had the time, money, and inclination, I would certainly take it on. But there are a number of places that you could say are my favorite. We just live in a very beautiful state that is very rich in culture, history, and people. So it would be, for me, it would be very difficult to say any one is my favorite. I don't know if you have a favorite, but
I really liked going through like Moses and Old Moses. Do you remember that?
yeah, that was along the Santa Fe Trail and rich in history. And I think, that was kind of like probably somebody along the Santa Fe Trail just decided, I'm not going any further. This is it. And that had been a journey in itself.
A lot of them along the Galenas, really, I love too.
Galenas is unique. The Galenas is very unique. There's so many settlements along that river that don't have names. And what is it, Malindre?
La Liendre.
Which is the lice, yes?
It's a string of lice. It's a string of
lice, which kind of describes that whole string of communities down the Galenas.
There's La Concepcion is there.
Yeah, and there are some beautiful old churches in there. I mean, it's very accessible to anybody. Anybody that, we did it in a 2-wheel drive car.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it when the weather is bad or snowy or rainy, but it's very accessible, and there's some really immense, beautiful history there. There are old churches that are still used today that to me are, the churches of New Mexico are the missions and the beauty that was put into and the construction of those churches was built by a community. So um, I'm fascinated with the churches. They're beautiful. Going inside of them is a treat if you get the opportunity. A lot of them, unfortunately, today are locked, but there is, I mean, New Mexico is just so full of history. It's just unreal.
Well, I mean, the cemeteries too. I mean, we have many cemeteries, especially in San Miguel County, that they predated us as a state. They predated the United States as a country. I mean, there are some stones that are early 1600s from, some of the very original people. They're in Spanish. A lot of them aren't in great condition, but it's amazing to me that they still survive.
So in the, I think my favorite of your Google Earth pictures is, I think it's the Sambrio. You can see the church, the outline of the church. And if I recall, I think you found that community through that outline of the church. Can you kind of walk me through, well, don't walk me through 3,000 hours of Google Earth, but what is Google, tell me about your Google Earth bit in this.
The Google Earth project is, like I say, you could spend an hour or 2 hours discussing it because you start looking at Google Earth and it almost becomes addictive. You find your first ruin, and you're like, wow, that's cool. And then you find something like Sombrio, where you find this church that is basically looks like a cross from a satellite image, and you're like, what is that? And it's a church. I mean, your mind just automatically clicks. Sorry about the cat. Your mind automatically clicks that it's a church. And you, of course, want to find out more about it. So that starts the curiosity into finding out what is that? What is the name of that church? And then to find out it's associated with a town and being able to go see it in person and look at it and go, wow, and I think for me, that's the cool thing about the Google Earth aspect is I see it. Bridget does the history part. I do the finding part. And I see this place from a Google Earth image. And then you get there and you're like, wow, it really exists. It really looks like what I saw on that image.
So you're using Google Earth to you're scanning across the Earth, and that's how you're finding some of these communities, is just spotting them.
It's interesting because you find one, and then the obsession starts, because as with the native ruins, especially, you can find one pit house or one Torion, and it's like in the middle of nowhere, and you're like, it can't be alone. So you start, and you're very zoomed into it. I mean, you're probably in a 300 to 500 feet above the ground stage. So you're seeing a very small area. So as you pan across, all of a sudden there's another one. You're like, okay, there's another one. And pretty soon, in a 10-minute time frame, you've now found 20 of these round pit houses or torions. I'm not quite sure what they are. But they're definite circles of rocks, and they're not natural. So when I do this, it becomes, the Spanish settlements. You can see, and literally like the sheep herders, it's an amazing thing because they used to build stone walls to keep the sheep in. So these stone walls literally are 500 to 800 feet long. And when you stop and think about the labor of building a stone wall that long, that's 3 to 4 feet high, it's a pretty intense project. I mean, and this guy's out there in the middle of nowhere on his own. He doesn't have help. So he probably, I don't know, a month building a wall. And he had to maintain watching the sheep, getting his food, and keeping his daily life while he's doing this. So you get a whole new respect for what these people went through, and to fight the elements, and then the floods and the rains and the snows, and as we all know, the wind in New Mexico is probably your worst enemy. But for me, I can almost visualize the life when I'm looking at the Google Earth part.
Right, great. So when I was kind of plotting the communities that you guys have talked about today, they're in a certain chunk of New Mexico, and we're the fifth largest state. You can't do the whole state, but are you expanding your range at all, or what's next for you guys?
Well, we've gone all over the state. So it's in 8 years, it's difficult to say, well, do 5 or 6 towns because there is so many of them that we've seen that have a history to them. And he has got things that are mapped that we probably won't get to in 15 years. I mean, it's literally that volume of stuff.
Okay,
So as far as what's next, I mean, we're still going through things that he mapped a year or two ago.
excellent.
Yeah.
I mean, we would love that, at some point, I mean, we probably are gonna have to retire. I don't know when that point is because,
Yeah.
I would love to be able to hand this whole project off to somebody young, and a couple preferably, that has a sense of adventure and a sense of historical value, to take it over. But it really, for us, it's been a fun thing, I think, overall. It at times becomes frustrating because both of us still working and finding time to do the history, the editing, and figuring out mainly how we're going to get to places takes a little bit of effort. But we do it because, I mean, to me, the reward really is when you post something and you have an 85-year-old woman that no longer lives in New Mexico, and she sees a church that she went to when she was a very young child or even a toddler. And she goes, I was baptized in that church and I haven't seen it in 65 years. And it's touching, to me at least, that you're giving somebody something back from their past. To me, that's very rewarding. And, it's not that this is monetarily rewarding to us because it isn't, but the rewards come. And also you get our followers a lot of times offer additional information and insight to the places we go. So to me, the New Mexico Byways Facebook page has become kind of a living history documentation place that hopefully people can gain some knowledge and learn something from it. That's what I hope anyway.
Well, I mean, and we've been working on, people have asked us, when are we going to write a book? And writing a book is a huge undertaking, especially like he said, we're both still working full time and we do this in our evenings and on our weekends. So, we've had the framework of a book going for about 2 years. So that's eventually going to come. And it's going to be a little bit different than what a lot of people that do similar things are putting out. These are places that, we put a lot of research into finding and a lot of research into documenting. It's not something that you're going to drive through town and say, oh, that's abandoned. That looks cool. We're going to go look at it. So that's something else that's on the eventual horizon whenever we get time to do it.
And it for us too, it's the Google Earth project to me is a very guarded secret because obviously it has GPS location marks on it. And unfortunately we have, more mainstream type ghost towns like say Encino, for example. Unfortunately, you get the people that feel a need to go in and vandalize or spray paint things. And we do our best to protect that because history is something that unfortunately fades over time. The ruins won't always be standing. So it is my hope, and I think Bridget's hope as well, that we document these places, why they still exist.
Well, I mean,
there's still something there to document.
And I mean, in one of the things that happens with history is, it's the overarching progress. People want to constantly move things forward. when a rancher buys land, or when someone who wants to farm buys land, there are old ruins on it. And to them, it's valuable farmland or valuable ranch land under it. There's no family left. They think that no one cares. So we've gone to a lot of places that we've found on Google Earth that we think are still there, only to go there and find that it's all been razed. That it was bought by a ranching company and they're going to use it for grazing land. So a lot of places we've documented 2 or 3 years ago are no longer there. They exist on a map, they exist in someone's memory, but a lot of the photographs that we have, I think, are some of the last ones that you're going to see of some of these places.
Right. You mentioned the gas pump was missing now,
Yes,
of the that great scene that you've got there. Yeah. Well, our audience isn't able to ask you questions because we're doing this in a pre-recorded thing, but you've got a great online presence. So where is really the best way to reach you? Is that Facebook, or?
You can reach out to our Facebook or Instagram or email us. You know, we're always happy to respond. We may not be as fast as we'd like at that, but we do get, if people send us an email or ask a question, we within probably a day or so, it usually respond.
Yeah, really the best place that most people are on Facebook, so they can send us a Facebook message, or our contact information is also on our Facebook page.
And we're very
Great.
Yeah, that's one thing that I like to tell people too, is that our page is very family friendly. That, you know, it's no politics, no memes, nothing that you would deem offensive. It's just the history and the pictures. So we try to make it a nice respite from the noise that's the internet.
Thank you again, Bridget and Michael. That was just really fun and a great view into the past, particularly places that, you know, I know I'll never get to see, and so many of our viewers won't actually get to go visit. So thank you for taking us there today.
Well,
Thank you.
We appreciate the invitation and we appreciate being here.
For our audience, in closing, a reminder to visit our website at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can watch past Friends of History lectures. Click on the lecture series link at the top of the page, then past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about the Friends of History and our lectures and other activities, join our mailing list or email us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. Finally, please consider making a donation to Friends of History, no matter the size, through our website so that we can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. And thank you to all of you who have already contributed to Friends of History. We'll see you next month. Thank you. Goodbye.